Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Excel Virtually Global. My name is Sam, and I will be your host this section and the next couple of sections. So this section will be about the Excel charting and smart mirror presented by Jon Peltier. So he will present you a powerful but not so obvious technique that enable you to reduce spatial visual effect in Excel chart.
Hello, my name is Jon Peltier, and I'll be giving a demonstration in Excel charting here. Um, I'm an Excel MVP and have been one for a little over 21 years. I've been running my own company, Peltier Technical Services, for 18 years, where I do all kinds of Excel stuff, including Visual Basic, including report generation, including all kinds of graphics and so forth. My background is I was a research scientist and a production engineer for quite a number of years. I have a doctorate degree from MIT in metallurgy, and funny how I ended up in as an expert in Excel because it seems most of those people are big finance guys, and I'm not a finance guy at all. But that's okay. I still have my skills, and because of my background in science and engineering, I know a lot about data visualization, which is to say charting. I probably know as much about Excel charting as almost anybody, and I also know a great deal about Visual Basic to program Excel to make tedious things happen a lot faster. This talk is part of the Excel Virtually Global Conference for 2022, and I'd like to thank Liam Bastick and the rest of the team at Some Product for inviting me to take part. So I mentioned I have a Doctor of Science degree, and when I was working on my thesis and doing research papers and so forth, this was what my computing was like. This is back in the mid 1980s. So this is going back a few years. These pictures come from the HP Computer Museum, um, which was run by a fan of HP products, and we used HP equipment to monitor tests in the lab, and then we used it to uh, output our data. The way the computer on the right worked, it took up about as much space as a laptop. It probably cost more than a current laptop does. It had a tape drive. It had very little RAM. I don't know, measured in hundreds of kilobytes probably, not megabytes certainly. It had a little uh, small CRT screen, which you had to squint to read. It had a thermal printer to output things, but you could write programs to do a lot of work in HP Basic. And if you thought Visual Basic was tough, HP Basic was really rudimentary. And what we did is we used it to communicate with a plotter like the one on the left, which had a few pens in a carousel. And what you would do, you would draw your charts in that plotter. But what you had to do was write an HP Basic program that essentially would draw your chart one line segment at a time. So if you wanted to draw a box to outline your chart, you would write a command that would say, get pen number one. And you had to keep track in your head which pens were which thickness and which color, and move to position XY, put the pen down, move to position X2, Y2, pen up, and so forth. And you had to do that line segment by line segment to build up your chart. And it took forever. And, when when I was finally writing my thesis, oh, I had this Mac Plus. It was gorgeous. It had a whole megabyte of RAM, and it had a program on it where I could put the data in, click a button, and out came a chart. And, we come to Excel and you can do the same thing. You select your data, click a button, and out comes a chart. But if you want to get some special effects that Excel doesn't offer, you can still be a little clever and draw your chart elements line segment by line segment. And I'm going to show you how to do that. I have a couple of examples here, and they both deal with creating custom axes, which is to say labels, grids, tick marks, what have you. Anything that is different than what the Excel experience offers out of the box, but you're going to learn how to do these things. The chart here is what I want my chart to look like. You see, I have some data points plotted on there, and instead of the regular axes, the data goes from 0 to 40. And what I want is not regular tick marks, not regular grid lines, not regular axis labels. I want an axis label and a grid line for every point in my data set. So instead of saying 0, 10, 20, 30, 40 across the horizontal axis, for example, it says 0, 8, 22, 31, 40, which are the X values of my data, and the same for the Y values along the vertical axis. And so let me just show you what we got here. This is the data in my chart in the top left. And what I need to do is, well, I'll just start bit by bit. Here's what my original chart looks like. If you just select the data and make a chart, it will look something like this. I've squared it up, but because normally you get it in a a rectangle, it looks like an index card, but here I've squared it up. And so how do we transform this into the chart on the left? And I'll leave the chart on the left there so we know what we're supposed to look at. And don't mind my cheat notes over here on the right. I do that because, like I said, I was doing charting in the mid 80s, and that was a while ago, and this helps my neurons keep up with what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my axis limits. And my axis limits are going to go from 0 to 40. So I'll select an axis. I'll use Control-1, which is my favorite shortcut in Excel. Actually, it's not my favorite. It's my second favorite. And you'll probably learn what my favorite is somewhere along the line, because I can't help but make a mistake. So my axis, I want it to be 0 to 40. So if I just leave that there, it's going to stay auto, and I don't want it auto because sometimes Excel has its own idea what to do. So I'm going to just say 0, and that will override 0 auto, and it'll be 0 manual. And I'll make that 40, and I'll make it steps of 10. And again, I'll overwrite the 10 just to make sure Excel doesn't get crazy ideas. Now I'll do the same thing with the vertical axis, and you can use the tab key to tab between the different places in the task pane. And by 10. And so that's what my regular axes would look like if they're done regularly. But you see, I don't have grid lines where I want, and I don't have labels where I want. And I can't do that with my regular axes because Excel uses regularly spaced tick marks and regularly spaced tick labels and regularly spaced grid lines. And I want to override all of that stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to clean up my axes. I'll leave the labels there for now, but I'm going to hide the axes by choosing to use no line, and I'll do the same thing with this axis. And some things with a chart, if you do the F4 key, it will repeat what you just did. So things like colors that you're applying, it will do, but things like markers you selected, no, it's not so nice as that. Well, anyway, I've hidden the axes, and I'm just going to select and delete the grid lines. So we're left with this naked chart, and that's one step closer to what I want. So now, how do you draw a line in Excel, in an Excel chart? You could come up to Insert and under Shapes and grab one of these lines and draw it, and it's hard to line it up perfectly, and you get it lined up perfectly, and then you say, oh, I want to move my chart over there, and you forgot to attach it to. That's just not the right way of doing it. But what you can do to add data to a chart is you can add another series that connects points to lines. And so what I want to draw a fake axis down here, which will have labels where I want, and another fake axis on the other side. And here's what my data is for the fake axis. for my x-axis, I'm going to use the x values for my original data, but I'm going to use 0 values for the y. So they'll be all aligned across here. And for the y-axis, my y values will come from my original data, but my x values will be zeros. So it'll be x equals 0 and y equals whatever. So how do you add data? That's easy. You select your range and you copy it. And you select the chart and you come up here to paste. And there's always an option called paste special. And we're going to use paste special. And I didn't use just paste because Excel's default are shown here. And because my data is lined up with my original data, Excel says, oh, I bet this guy wants to just add new points. And I don't want to add new points. I want to add a new series for the x-axis. So I'll check new series and I'll check series names in first row. And it already guessed that I wanted categories in the first column. And so I'll leave that and I'll say, okay. And there's my new x-axis. And you see now I have, you see my markers, they correspond to the x coordinates of my points. That's great. That's just what I want. Now I'm going to copy my y-axis data. And again, I'm going to use paste special, or there's a shortcut. It's very mnemonic, Alt-ESV. It comes from the old Excel 2003 menu system, which doesn't exist anymore. But Microsoft was nice and they left all those shortcuts in place for us. So we didn't have to train our muscles, new memories. And again, add cells as a new series names in first row, categories in first column. Okay, and there's our y-axis. Okay, so that's cool. So what I'm going to do is, let me just check my notes. Yeah, so each of these series now, I'm going to make them temporarily look like an axis. Actually, kind of they permanently will. But so let me I'll change the line color and I'll use the next to the last one in the first column of colors. And then I'll select my other axis series. It's a dummy series. And I'll hit F4 to apply the same color that I just did. And then I'll come here and I'll change it to 0.75 points, which is 1 pixel. And then I'll select the other axis and I'll do F4. So I'm going back and forth a lot, but that's just so I don't have to keep selecting the same color multiple times if possible. And now I'll come to marker and marker options. First thing I'm going to do is pick a fill of no fill. And then I'll select the other markers over here and I'll do the same thing. And then now, and then for border, I'll select that same gray color. And then I'll select these circles and I'll do F4. And then finally, I'll choose what marker shape I want to use. Automatic in Excel 2013 and later is a circle, and I don't want that. I want one of the built-in ones. And the reason I formatted the fill color and the border color first is if I had not done it first, you could not have seen that this was a plus icon. It would have just been a colored square because the fill and the border would be the same. But I have no fill, so you can see the plus sign. Now, if I select this one, I can't use F4 because Excel isn't smart enough to use F4 if I change the marker style. It used to be in Excel 2003 and before, but not anymore. So now it sort of looks like a dummy axis with the plus sign markers look like axis tick marks. I'm not going to use them as axis tick marks finally. You see over here, if I have grid lines, I'm not going to add clutter by adding tick marks to my chart. But anyway, I have points now everywhere. I have these tick marks. And now to get my labels for those tick marks, I'm just going to add data labels to my these points. So you click on that plus sign and you get different things here and data labels. And if you just check the box, it'll give you default data labels. And you see they appear above the points, and I don't want them above the points. But if I check that little chevron, I can put them to the left of the points. And there's my new labels at 40, 28, 20, 12, and 0. That's exactly the y-axis values. And now I come to my other series, and I want data labels there, and I want them below. So I select below, and there's my new data labels below. And now you see a little problem here. All those data labels say 0, and but the data labels for the y-axis work. Well, the reason is the default data labels show the y value, and that's fine for the y-axis. I'm going to uncheck leader lines too. I rarely use them. I find even when I do use them, it's because the chart is so cluttered that I have to redo the chart. But now I'm going to select the other, the x-axis labels, the pseudo x-axis pseudo labels, and instead of y value, I'm going to say x value. And then I'm going to uncheck y value and uncheck my leader lines. And now you can see I have data labels corresponding to those tick marks. And that's pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do, I want to hide the built-in axis labels. But I'm not going to just delete them. Well, if I just delete them, the whole axis gets lost, and that could be problematic if I need to make changes to the chart later. There's also, in labels, the default is to put the labels next to the axis, but I can choose none. But if I do that, Excel takes away the space that it left in the margin for those labels. And you see now it has squished the axis way over, and my labels aren't in the right position with respect to the axis. So now my favorite Excel shortcut is Control-Z, or Control-Z to some of the British-speaking people. And it's also a good shortcut in all different programs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the number format to display those labels. So I'll come down here to number, click it, and I have to scroll up. And what I want to do is add a code here. And my code is going to look like this. And it's a little bit tricky at first until you understand what it's doing. I'm going to do underscore 0. What the underscore does is it says in the display, leave a space as big as the character after the underscore. So that means leave a space as wide as a 0. And then I'm going to do underscore 0, underscore 0. And through some trial and error, I learned that 5 underscore zeros is just right for this, because I think charts aren't as smart as cells when it comes to these number formats, and the spacing isn't really quite one character width of 0. So you have to kind of over compensate. And then if I just leave it like that, if I get a 0 value, it'll leave a dash there, and I don't want a dash cluttering up the white space around my chart. So I'm going to put 3 semicolons. And so in a number format, you have 4 elements, up to 4 elements you can identify, which generally are positive numbers, negative numbers, zeros, and text. And if there is just nothing in between the semicolons, it won't show that kind of value at all. So I'll click Add, and you'll see the axis, it might have moved a slight bit, but those built-in data labels went away. So I'm most of the way there now. I have to actually repeat that for the other axis. So now, since I already defined that, I can come here and under the type of format, I can select Custom. And you see, through experimenting, I had one with 3 and one with 5. So I'll select the one with 5, and you see those axis labels went away. So now I have axis labels exactly where I want them, and that's great. So now I want to get my grid lines. So what am I going to use for grid lines? Well, there's another way that you can draw a line on a chart. And so I'm going to select these data points along the pseudo horizontal axis. And of course, grid lines, it's not going to give me the grid lines I want because it only has the default ones in here. And so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to add error bars to those points. and I'm going to add more options. And you see what's selected are vertical error bars, and you can see it extends above the axis and below the axis. Although the ones below the axis aren't visible, you can see the tick marks there, but um, a uh, an error bar can't be drawn outside the plot area. The plot area is the highlighted internal axis there now. And let me go over here to my other series, and I'll add my error bars there, again using more options. So I only want to use the horizontal error bars for the vertical axis and vice versa for the horizontal axis. So let's first of all, that's the vertical one, which I don't want, and it's selected here, so I'm going to delete them. And over here, it's really hard to select those. You know, the point gets in the way, the lines get in the way. That time I got lucky and selected it. But if there's something you're trying to select and it's hard to do, there's a couple ways to do it. If the chart is active, you can go to the chart design tab, not the chart format tab, and you can find it in the drop-down list in the top left of the ribbon. But also, if you right-click on the chart, you get that same drop-down, which appears in a little flyaway thingy, and you can see that my error bars appear here. So my x-axis, I don't want my x-axis labels, so I'll delete those. I mean, x-axis, I don't want my x direction error bars. And now let's format these things. So now here's my y-axis, my y direction error bars on my x-axis. So we'll come over here to the error bar task pane. I want them to go in the plus direction. And I want them not to have that end cap. So instead of looking like a T, they just look like an I. And for fixed value, that's easy. It has to go from 0 to 40. So I want them to be 40 long. So there's my error bars. Those are my custom grid lines. And I'll do the same thing that I did to the one axis. I'll do to the other. I'll make them plus. And no cap, fixed value of 40. And there they are. And now they're a little too dark. You don't want error bars to be darker than your data. You want things to be lighter. In fact, you want the error bars to be even lighter than the axis lines. So I'm going to pick a line color, the second one down on the left column of the palette there. And I'll select the vertical ones, and I'll say F4, and there's my chart. And in fact, since I don't need those little tick marks there, I'm just going to format my series to have no markers, and I'll format this one to have no markers. And there, I've duplicated that original chart. Now, suppose I did want short inside tick marks for those positions. What I can do is I'll take these and I'll format the color to make them as dark as the axis. And I'll do this first because once I make them shorter, it's harder to select them. And I'll select that one and I'll say F4. And now, what's a good length for a tick mark? Well, we'll try 1 in this case. It depends on your axis scale, of course. And, you might have to go back and forth and tweak it a little bit. And I'll say 1 for that. And here's my internal tick marks, my inside tick marks for that pseudo axis. And actually, I probably would want to make them a little shorter than that, but that's fine. So the one thing that's harder to do is, what if I want those to be on the outside of my axis? I can change from plus to minus, and I can change this from plus to minus. And you see they're selected, they're still there, but because the lines of the error bars go outside the plot area, they don't appear. So what we have to do is a little trick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select each axis, and instead of the scale going from 0 to 40, I'm going to make the scale go from -2 to 40. So you see the whole, the plot area, the apparent fake axes that I drew didn't really move. They might have moved a pixel, but I made the plot area wider. See, now the plot area goes wider than it did. So the error bars that extended outside the plot area before now fit within the plot area. And this other axis, see, I'm playing around. You can also select a chart element from clicking in the task pane. And now what I want is my vertical axis. I want to make that one start at -2. And now all my external tick marks show. And I'm going to use this trick in my next example, which is a little bit more complicated. So in this workbook that I'm using, I have this one sheet for this example where I did the work, and there's another sheet just after it where I go step by step through all the procedures so that you can try to recreate it on your own later. So now I'm going to go to my next example. And this one's going to be a little bit different. As I said before, I worked as a research scientist, and when you submit a chart to a research organization for publication in their journal, you have to adhere to certain data visualization standards, and they can be a little bit tricky to do, especially in Excel. Now, in this case, what they want is, see, my data still goes from 0 to 40. It's the same data that I used before. And when I select it, you see it's highlighted there. But what they want is for that plot area, that bounding box, to extend a little bit beyond the data. So say it goes maybe from -2 to 42. And the same with the y-axis, -2 to 42. But we can't use the plot area for that because we need to be able to show tick marks on the outside. So, and we know how to put tick marks where we want. And here I'm just going to put them in the default places, but because I've moved made the axis wider at the bottom and the left, my axis now would start at -2, and then it'd be 8 and 18 and so forth, and those are bad tick marks. So really my construction details for this chart are shown here. So I have my data goes from 0 to 40 on both axes, and I want to draw a box surrounding the data at -2 to 42 all the way around. And then I want my tick marks on the outside of that. So my plot area is actually this orange dashed line around everything. And so what I need to do is, well, take a few steps to sort of build this in my chart. I don't need to have a box for this. I just drew it here to illustrate where the data goes. I do need a box that goes around the data at a certain point, and I don't need to show the plot area. That's just going to be sitting there. So here's what I'm going to do. Again, I'm starting with my original data, and I'm going to set my axis limits. And again, I'll start with 0 and 40 by 10. So that's the basis of my chart. And again, I'm start with 0 and 40 by 10. So there's the basis of my chart. But now, as I said, I want my plot area, I want to draw a line at -2. So I want my plot area to be at -3. So let me just change my axis scale just a little bit. So I'll expand my plot area by changing this to -3, and that's not the minus sign, is it? -3 and 42 by, it actually doesn't even matter by what amount because that's all going to be hidden. But then I'll do the same thing for the other axis, and I'll say -3, 42. So now my plot area has grown a little bit. You see my plot area now is highlighted. And what I need to do is move my axes out a little bit so that my fake axis labels will correspond to the built-in hidden axis labels. So what I want to do is make my axes cross at -2. And I have to do that for both axes. So now those cross at axis value of -2. And so now what I want is a dummy. Well, I want a box that goes around the outside, and it will go along where the real axes are. And then I will have fake axis points along there where I will put my labels and my tick marks, and away we go. So everything is there. I'm going to hide my axes now. So let me first of all choose no line for my axis, and the same for that axis. And now I'm going to get rid of the built-in grid lines because most technical papers don't even like any grid lines because it clutters up the chart. And now what I need to do, first I'm going to draw my outline. So I have the same sort of fake axis data as I did before, except I'm going to put for my X values and Y values, they're going to be where I want the labels. So 0, 10, 20, 30, 40. And they're also at -2. So they're going to be on the edge of my bounding box. And my bounding box, my outline, is shown here. Now, these little rectangles are going to get in my way. But anyway, so here's my outline. I'm going to add my outline first. So I'll copy that. I'll select my chart. I'll do paste special, new series, remember, series names in first row, categories in first column, and I'll say OK. And here's my box that surrounds my data, and that's almost perfect. What I'm going to do is just format it a little bit. I'm going to use no marker, and for line, I'm going to use that gray color, which is the next to the last one in that first column, and I'm going to make it 1 pixel wide, 0.75 points. And so there's my boundary around the whole chart. In fact, once we submit this to the Academy for publication, we're going to use no line for the chart area border. But I like keeping it there when I'm still working, and and I didn't mean to use that setting, so I went to use automatic, so it's a little bit lighter color. These details are important when you have OCD. So there's my bounding box. I'm going to add my x-axis and y-axis data. So I'll copy that data and I'll paste special. Oh, look at that. It remembered the last way I did it, even though it was lined up. So it's going to do it as a new series. I didn't notice it did that before. So here's where our 0, 10, 20, 30, 40 are located. And now I'll do my y-axis, paste special, new series. Good. So now I'm going to go through the same steps I did before. So I'm going to add data labels. So in this case, I'm going to add data labels below the points along the bottom. And you see now they say -2 because that's the new y values of those points. And I'm going to add data labels to the left of my vertical axis points. And what I have to do now is change what's displayed in those labels. And what's displayed is X value, not Y value. And let's get rid of leader lines, and I can get rid of my leader lines there. We want to hide the regular labels now. So I'm going to come back to the format axis number format box, and I'm going to find that custom one with 5 underscore zeros. And I'm going to do the same thing to the the real horizontal axis, and I'll add. And so those are hidden now. And now I want to add my error bars for my tick marks. And so I'm going to select those points, and I'm going to add error bars, and I'm going to say more options. And I'm going to do the same thing here. If you don't say more options, what happens is it uses something like standard error. And if I did them here, I would have a standard error of 0. So it's impossible to even see that they're there. So I like to always use more options, because I never want to use any of those things. I always want to use something special. So we're going to use fixed value of 1. Okay, so the vertical ones are right. I'm going to do it in the minus direction. No cap, and fixed value of 1 is good. And over here, first of all, I want to select the Y error, no, the X. Did I not delete? Oh, I didn't delete the X error bars on the X axis. So we'll delete those. And now I'll come up here and I'll select the Y-axis Y error bars, which I don't want. And now I'll select the Y-axis X error bars. And I'll format those the same way. So I'll go minus, and I'll say no cap, and a fixed value of 0. You know, what's funny is if you select plus and put a negative number in here, it looks like minus error bars. You know what? It's not letting me do that. Maybe they thought that was a bug. No problem. So see, here's my error bars, which are tick marks. So all I have to do is hide these series. So let me kill the marker and use no line, and then F4 to repeat the no line on that series, and kill the marker. And here's my chart, just like the other one. And in fact, I'm going to make it slightly better, because when you're dealing with pixels, you see that the tick marks on the horizontal axis don't look quite as long as the ones on the vertical axis, do they? And so what I'm going to do is show how you can use custom error bar values. So what I have is a little grid. It's off in a hidden place in my sheet, and it starts out saying 1 and 1, which is what the tick marks are now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my x-axis Y error bars, and instead of fixed value, now here, if I had put a negative number in the cell, it'll reverse the direction of the error bar. But anyway, so fixed value, instead of 1, I'm going to use custom, and I'm going to specify a value. And positive error value, I don't want any. You can't leave that blank because it won't accept what you put in for the negative. But if you type a 0, that'll be fine. And then negative error value, x-axis, I'm going to select that cell for 1. And I'm going to say OK. And it didn't change because it's the same value, just defined by that range. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the y-axis x error bars, and I'm going to select custom, specify value, again 0 for positive, and for y-axis I'm going to click on the 1, and this is likely up. This time it's going to work. Sometimes it doesn't delete the initial value, which was a 1 in brackets there, and I'll say OK, and so now that's fine. But now I want to make that a little bit shorter, so I'm going to say, oh, let's try 0.6 for the x-axis. Oh, the x-axis I wanted to be 0.8. So there's that. It's longer than the default Excel tick marks, but I think the default Excel tick marks are too short. Let's try 0.6 for the y-axis. Let's try -1 for the y-axis. You see, now I get a positive value, but let's keep it with 0.6. And so now that's a little bonus. How do you make your tick marks, it's a pain. Like if your axis changes or you have to resize the chart, now the one that you started with isn't the right size, so you have to get in and change it. But you don't have to. You can use the custom, and then it's so much easier to change by changing a value in the cell rather than going back through the task pane. So these were two very similar examples for customizing the appearance of your chart axes, including the grid lines and tick marks. And hopefully you can use them next time you're submitting a paper to a prestigious scientific journal for publication. Thank you very much.
That's Jon Peltier. So I noticed that there's a question in the Q&A section. So John, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I could do that. I'm trying to open up a sample file. Okay, I just had one. Hang on a
I just
second.
add the question for the audience to hear the question out. Okay.
Okay, why don't you do that?
Okay. I know, John, I know you like SPG charts. Do you happen to use custom axis XY in those kind of charts to change, say, the upper control limit for a specific data series and the lower control limit for another data series? John, you can share your screen.
Okay, I'm looking for the button that'll let me share it. Okay, it says I can share content. Oh, here it is. Every one of these video programs has buttons in a different place in a different color. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll share this screen here. Give me a moment while I drag the file over here.
Just a second.
Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, this is an example of the kind of control chart that Anthony asked about. And you see it has some data that has been collected. Actually, this is probably just random data I used when I was testing this. And we have 3 lines on this data. One of them indicates the center line of the data, which in this case is just the average value. And what that is it's a series of points. Never mind these dialogues that pop up. It's just a series of points connected by the green line, and it's the same technique that I used to make the dummy axes in my presentation. And by the same token, for the upper and lower control limits, those are, pardon those things, those again, it's another series with a calculated offset from the center line below and above the lines, just to indicate what the what the limits are. And it's just easy to use additional series for this because you can calculate the numbers in the cell, and any numbers you have in the cell, you can add them to a chart very easily. The nice thing about using a series is, let's suppose for some reason I want to look at data that perhaps has a linear trend. You see that if I just used an error bar, you can't get an error bar that's not horizontal or vertical, whereas these limits that I've drawn here are inclined based on a least squares fit of the data here. By the same token, when you have this kind of chart, this is an I chart, and where I means you're showing the individual values, and then there's also a corresponding MR chart, which is a moving range, which basically is the difference between one point and the previous point. And the same thing here, I have an average of the moving range in green, and I have an upper bound on the moving range, which is red. And I know if I have any points that go outside that red line, or if I have any points that go outside these red lines, I'm in a point where the process that I'm measuring is not in statistical control. The other thing you can do is if I have a run chart, I can look at a certain test where I'm looking at runs about the median. That's just how many times the data is above the median and then it drops below, or is below and it goes above. And for that, I just illustrate the median again with a horizontal line, which is another series of data added to this chart. I presume that answers the question.
Yes, thank you for your answers. That's quite insightful. Um, let's see.
Are there any more questions? Also, if anybody does have a follow-up question on this or anything else that I do that is interesting to you, send me an email. Say, hey, I caught you at the Excel Virtually Global conference, and I have a question. And I like hearing from people that have seen my presentations, and I answer dozens of questions like this a week. It's part of what makes what I do fun. So
It looks like there's only one question right now, Jon Peltier.
okay,
Um,
somebody is asking, can I please share some tips in creating charts? It's funny, I'm working on a book right now with Mr. Excel, Bill Jelen, and for 20 years or more, I've been answering questions online in the various forums, and I decided a good idea for a book would be to take a lot of these questions and put them together in a book. Like, how do I make my chart do this? How do I make my chart do that? I have a lot of tutorials on my website. The first tip in creating a chart, and it's not so much a tip as best practice, but that is to make sure you get your data right in the first place. If your data isn't right, it can make charting very frustrating and tedious. You can spend 5 minutes getting your data right before you make a chart, or 5 hours trying to get your data right, get your chart right if the data isn't right. And I actually have a blog post which describes good chart data, and that if you go to Google and you enter site, the word SITE, site : peltiertech.com, and then good chart data, you'll come right to that page and you can read about good chart data. It's about having all your data in one block without empty rows and columns in between, simplifying the formatting so you can just visually look at it to see if it looks like it's going to make a good chart. Have your X values in the first column, have your series names in the first row, and so forth. Those are some of the tricks about good data. You have to understand what chart type you want, what type of data you have. If it's timeline data, you probably want to make a line chart, which will help you trace whatever the variable is that you're tracking over time. If you're plotting, the examples in my talk here were geared at like technical presentations, scientific journals that plot experiments and so forth, or you might be plotting how the magnetic field varies as you increase the amount of current going through a motor, say. And so you have numerical data on both axes, and that's an XY scatter chart, and so forth. Other tips creating charts. I don't know. I'm not even sure where, excuse me, I'm not even sure where to start. But there's just a lot of things. What you can do is, if you have trouble trying to do something with a chart, you can just go to Google and, help with my Excel chart x-axis, and you'll get a whole bunch of different um, replies, and they might send you to forums, or they might send you to blogs like mine, and so forth. So if you have specific questions, I'll be glad to address them. Other than that, I'm trying to make up questions in my head, and beyond get the data right, there's no first thing that you have to know. Also, if you know what makes good data and you know a little bit about making charts, when you have bad data, you can figure out how to work with the bad data and still get a decent chart out. But get the data right makes it easier and faster and less frustrating.
I would certainly read some of your book for improving my charting skill. That sounds very interesting book.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on the first chapter, and I have a lot of um, examples, and I won't use anywhere near all the examples I have. I'm just trying to, organize it. And like I say, I'm in the first chapter, and I think the book will be out sometime next spring. So looking
Yeah,
forward to
can't
that.
wait.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your presentation and the Q&A section. Now we will wait to move on to the next section with Alejandro Hova with the custom function in Power Query and how they can improve your games. Thank you, Jon.
Thanks so much.